Hi everybody. My name is Sasha, and I'm going to help moderating the talk today. So yeah, welcome. And we're really excited to have Martha Havenith with us today. It should be a really fun and interesting conversation. And the main thing to know is that we're going to have a question and answers at the end. So if you do have a question at any point, please feel free to put it in the chat box. And hopefully we'll be able to get to it at the end. We'll definitely be keeping track of the questions that come in.
Just to clarify, Sasha, the chat box, with the chat box, you mean the question and answers? Yeah?
Yes, the question and answers. Yeah, exactly.
That's important. Yeah.
And also make sure to check the chat box every now and then. We'll be dropping a few links at various points as they are relevant. So if something particularly piques your interest, and you may see something pop up there from us. But mostly it's going to be our wonderful speaker. So I'm gonna hand it over to Henrik to do a little intro. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sasha. So I feel honored to welcome Dr. Martha Havenith tonight. So Martha and we and us from the Mind Foundation, we got to know each other lately when in a network of university institutes and clinics that are building around psychedelic research. And it was a surprise, a big surprise, Martha. That was a very good surprise that you are very interested in the science of breathing and breath. How come?
Well, it's basically, so I'm kind of a transdisciplinary being myself. So I'm actually a coach. I'm a coach in connective breathwork, which is kind of similar to holotropic breathwork, but that was initially completely separate from my science. And I just saw these, amazing things happening in sessions and thought it would be so great if we can find out a little bit more about how they can work in terms of the brain. And so I've been digging through the literature a lot, and I hope I can pass it on in an interesting way.
That's very cool. So let me tell you in a few words where Martha comes from. She has a sound scientific background, of course. She made her bachelor in psychology, actually, at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt. Then kept on in her studies, doing research with Tilman Habermas still in Frankfurt. Did her master in neuroscience at Oxford University, and a PhD in neurophysiology. So you're actually somebody who is looking at structures in the brain, doing research on, for example, visual cortex. So you did research on the visual cortex of cats in your PhD. That's already like 5 or 6 years ago, was it?
A bit longer.
A bit longer.
A
It was
bit longer,
2009.
but just a little bit.
Yeah. And then you went on to become a research group leader at the Ernst Strüngmann Institute for Neuroscience. And this is associated with the Max Planck Institute. And you actually have a laboratory of your own. What are you doing there?
Well, so it's really different from the things I'm going to be talking about here. So I generally look at vision and visual perception. And I especially want to know how visual perception is shaped moment by moment by all the stuff that's actually not visual, right? So your memories, expectations, how alert you are at each moment, what your motivation is, and so on. So all these things actually also go into building your visual perception of the world. And I want to see how that shows in the neuronal activity patterns at each moment, basically how you can identify all these little influences.
Yeah.
So I do that in mice. So again, very different. I do that in mice, and I let them play video games.
So, Martha, when you look at your history of animal research, what was the most surprising thing that happened to you in your career?
That's a good question. I think personally, kind of the most sort of interesting moment for me was actually very early. That was when I was still studying and I was doing an internship at the Max Planck Institute. And I was trying to solve a problem, and I'm like, well, how do you do this? And my supervisor said, well, I don't know. No one's done it before. And that was one of those moments where I thought, oh, this is kind of like being in a jungle. There's not actually a road that's been made yet. And so that was really, for me personally, one of those really surprising turning points in life. But in terms of the science, I think the coolest and most surprising thing is that mice are incredibly intelligent. Because you always hear, well, they're kind of simple, tiny animals. But then when you really look at how they behave, they actually have a very precise way of understanding the world, of understanding rules of how to behave. And most of the time when they look stupid, it's because we're annoying them and they don't feel like cooperating. So that was at first very surprising, and I think it's very cool.
Depriving them of environments where they can show their intelligence.
Exactly. And also basically not giving them enough motivation to do the things we want them to do, right? So exactly. So that's very exciting to see how intelligent they can be when you stop annoying them.
So Martha, we need to find the bridge to breathwork now. And so let me start with a very general question that pops up in every conference probably. And then we take it down to breathwork. So do you think that the gap between what you as a neuroscientist know about the brain and the subjective experience of people has narrowed in the last decade, or did it get broader?
I think it's generally narrowed for several reasons. I mean, we do understand the brain a whole lot better than we did 10 years ago. That's part of it. But I also do feel a shift in the culture, and clearly organizations like the Mind Foundation, I think, are actually really leading that, where you see that, well, I think meditation helped a lot, where this was the first time where basically you had this like obscure spiritual practice that monks in Tibet do, and then you put people in the scanner and you say, no, this is real. This is a very real, very concrete kind of thing that's being done. And then also because actually scientists themselves very often have these kinds of experiences and don't talk about it, right? Nobody said, oh, I was on an ayahuasca retreat, or I did a Vipassana retreat, or all these kinds of things. And yet, of course, that goes into the way you do your science. And so I feel like the gap is narrowing, and that it's also more accepted to say these subjective experiences matter, and they actually do manifest in a palpable way. But there's still a long way to go. I think, we're going in the right direction, but there's a long way to go.
So we're very excited to hear about your perspective on breathing. Let me just give 2 sentences about the place of breathwork and breathing in the Mind Foundation, and then it's your stage. So we in the Mind Foundation, we are a science and education organization, and actually just today we've done a big step in our own development as an organization. We moved into a new office, practice clinic, and academy space here in Berlin, and so we are all very happy to go to the next step of growth and building ourselves. And one of the things that we are doing is we're having some, of course we're supporting psychedelic research, but we are having something like that we call a translational project. So which we're looking at technologies, techniques, methods of people to get into altered states of consciousness that are not so much researched, and where we mainly find practitioners with very different sets of theories, and try to translate what they experience into the language of science, try to kickstart some investigation into what people do, and feedback what researchers have to the practitioners. So not everybody is open for that, but that's actually what we understand as translational research, to have a two-side conversation about what scientists think about the methods and what practitioners think about the methods. And I think breathwork is a very good example. So I guess you'll be talking about what breathwork is, so I don't have to do it. And so happy to hear your talk.
Right. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, it's really awesome to be here. I'm a huge fan of the Mind Academy, so it's really fun to actually be able to contribute to it. This is interesting. So I'm trying to share my screen, and it said host disabled attendee screen sharing.
So Sasha, I think that's your part. You have to enable Martha screen sharing.
Okay, one moment.
So good that you can, yeah.
Okay, you
I am
should
now
be
the
able to do
co-host.
it. There you go.
See?
Apologies.
No problem. Let me see. I should have tried this before because now I have to tell.
That's good. People are breathing. They breathe in deeply and
Okay,
try
let's
to
try it
look at the
again.
quality of your breath. There it is.
How's this? Oh, there we go. Well done. Here we go. Yay. Excellent. Well, so we're going to talk about how you can use different breathing techniques to basically change the way you process the world, process your life experiences. And as we talked about a little bit already, so I'm a neuroscientist, but I'm also a breathwork coach. So I've experienced and also witnessed firsthand that breath can have an incredibly powerful effect on your mental state. And so my interest and my angle on this is really that I'd love to look at this not only from the point of view of subjective experience, but also look at it from a more scientific framework in a sort of transdisciplinary way, and really look at the neural processes that are underlying those experiences. So before we continue, I should maybe clarify two things. So in this context, we'll talk about specific breathing techniques a little bit later on. But in this context, when I'm talking about conscious breathing, I just mean any type of technique where you're consciously changing the way your breath flows and you're keeping track of it. And when I talk about powerful effects, well, so there's some of them that by now I think are pretty well accepted in sort of mainstream discourse. Like, for example, the fact that certain breathing techniques can reduce your stress and anxiety or your pain perception. Also that breathing can reduce inflammation and boost your immune system. But there's also effects of breathing that can be slightly weirder to people. So for example, it may activate physical abilities that you don't feel like you have normally. I've seen people do crazy yoga poses who in normal life do not look like and also don't subjectively feel like they could do that. It can heighten or change your sensory experience. It can help you to reconnect with memories, for example, that are either forgotten or suppressed, with very strong emotions, with insights. And it can even enable visions. So what I mean by that, I'm quite purposefully not saying hallucinations, because hallucinations would be something where you think what you're seeing is real. By visions, I mean as you're seeing something and it's kind of a non-verbal form of relating to or understanding something within yourself. So these later statements might seem a little bit surprising or a little bit new, but actually they're not new at all. They're actually very, very old knowledge. And a surprising number of cultures around the globe have found different approaches to harness some of these effects of breathing. So just as a little fun idea, so here, to give you a little flavor of all the things that have been done so far. So Asia is definitely like a big focal point of different breathing techniques. So, oh, why is it not doing this? So you have more meditative breathing techniques, like for example, Zen and Qigong. Then in India, you have a whole list of breathing techniques in itself. For example, there's the pranayama, which is a sequence of different breaths that do a lot of different things, actually. So they can help your physical health, they can increase your both physical and psychological energy levels, but they can also enhance spiritual experiences, calm your mind. So there's a whole lot of different things going on. Kundalini yoga, which is also something that newer breathing techniques have definitely drawn on. So that also really increases your energy, both physical and psychologically. Then in Tibet, you again have a whole range. One of the really fun ones is the Tumo technique, also called fire breath. So that's something where Tibetan monks go out in the snow overnight without any shelter, and you have this breathing technique to really raise your energy, raise your core temperature, and produce so much heat that you can go through a night in the snow. Then in Aboriginal cultures, there's circular breathing. So you breathe deep in and out all the time. And that's funny enough also used to play the didgeridoo. Then actually in quite different places in the world, there's throat chanting, which again takes quite a circular breath in order to produce these tones where you have both an upper and a lower register in your voice at the same time. This is something I found out quite recently, so I don't know, maybe you also don't know. So in Hawaii, actually the word aloha means sacred breath. So there's also different types of breathing practices that are actually part of traditional ceremonies. And then there's a whole range of things that happen across the Americas in Native American culture. So for example, there are certain approaches where especially you use a very fast in and out breath through the nose to heighten your senses. For example, when you have to go hunting at night, when you have to find water with your sense of smell, when you have to do what people call seeing, so you kind of take in your environment and feel where are the good places, where are the places that are not so good. And so you take in a lot of kind of subconscious information. Again, also to accumulate energy, both mentally and physically, and interestingly also to let go of past experience. So there's certain breathing techniques where you basically envision the experience, let go of the experience, envision, let go, and so on. And another very nice breathing tradition in Africa, which is called breathing your ancestors. And the way it works is that you breathe until you feel a connection to one of your ancestors. And then you let yourself be basically the instrument for that ancestor to release messages, experience, or other things. So that's also a healing breath practice. So yeah, lots of different things, which brings up one question: what's up with Europe? So I think I see sort of two ideas here. Maybe Europe just doesn't have a strong breathing practice traditionally, or maybe sort of the Christian missionaries erased a lot of evidence of that, because basically when we talk about Europe, we're never really talking about the native European cultures, right? Sort of the Nordic, Germanic, Gallic, and so on cultures. And it might well be that they had traditions like this and we just don't know about it. Either way, it doesn't look very strong for the Europeans. But the really interesting question here is, why did so many cultures focus on breathing? If this is just about putting your attention or your consciousness on some kind of everyday physical process, then you might just as well have, sacred chewing or sacred blinking or whatever. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Breathing really seems to be something that's harnessed by many, many different traditions. So, of course, there's no definite answer to that. But one really intriguing idea that I think is also pretty well supported by evidence is that you really have to think about this in terms of embodiment. So what I mean by that is that, so both your mental resources, strengths, talents, and so on, but also traumata and wounds and difficulties are basically generally experienced in an embodied way. Now, in a lot of cultures, I probably wouldn't have to say this at all, but here we are on a Zoom webinar, so I think I should make this a little bit more explicit. So to give a really simple example, if you have a spider phobia, the problem is not that you think, oh, spiders are like the most dangerous thing on earth. The problem is that when you see a spider, you start sweating and your heart rate goes up and you start breathing all funny and you might get dizzy. And you can see these are all embodied sensations that actually define this phobia or this trauma. And similarly, for example, when you feel confident, you don't just think, oh, I'm very good at this. You actually feel your muscles being relaxed and ready for action, your heart rate is steady, and so on and so on. Your facial muscles might be different. So all of these things only really make sense when we think of them in relation to our physical experience. And if you want to put this in a more sort of neuroscientific way, it means that they are expressed through the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system, this is kind of how it looks. So this is this whole network of nerves that goes through your entire body and regulates all the stuff that needs to be regulated. But that's not under your conscious control. So adjusting your eyes too far and near visions, producing tears, saliva, your heart rate, your breathing for sure, your digestion, sweating, blushing, sexual organs, all of those things. And now the whole point of the autonomic nervous system is that it's not really under the direct control of your brain. So if we want to change our experience of the world, we need to not just change our brain, we actually need to also change our body. That means we also need to change the way our autonomic nervous system reacts to certain things. And now the interesting thing about breathing is that normally it is actually part of the autonomic nervous system, but it can also be voluntary. That means your brain can also interface with it. And at the same time, it's part of a sort of full body feedback loop, right? So the way you breathe is not just a thing on its own. It also changes your heart rate. It changes the oxygen levels in your blood, and thereby it again changes a lot of, for example, hormone releases and so on. So it's basically one of the ways in which we can bridge the gap between the central nervous system, the brain, and the autonomic nervous system. So I think that's a nice way of thinking about it. This is obviously a very general statement. Okay, we're trying to bridge the gap between the brain and the autonomic nervous system. But how would this actually look in terms of neuroscientific insights? Well, before I get to the neuroscience of breathing and then of conscious breathing, let's first take a step back. So I was super pleased when I saw at the beginning that people come from lots and lots of different backgrounds, and that there's also practitioners listening. So I thought I'd take a couple of minutes to just go through the basic of what neuroscience lingo looks like and what neuroscientists generally look at, just to make sure that we're on an even footing, so to speak, in the rest of the talk when I look at all these neuroscientific studies. So first of all, let's start with the super basic stuff. Your brain consists of lots and lots of neurons, millions of neurons, which look kind of like this extremely dense forest. This is actually already thinned out a lot so that you can even see single neurons, and they all produce these tiny electrical currents called either action potentials or spikes, and send them to each other. And so about 90% of these neurons are excitatory, which means that when they send these impulses to each other, they excite each other, they make each other more active. But about 10% are so-called inhibitory, which means that when they are active, they're actually making the other neurons less likely to be active. And they're actually very important because they kind of function a lot of the time as the sort of conductor that shapes the general response of the population into certain rhythms or certain patterns. Now, when we look at the activity of such neurons, don't do this again. Just there we go. Then there's a lot of stuff to find out. So for example, these are now, let's say, the spikes of 20 neurons over 1 second. But what we really want to look at is the activity of, let's say, hundreds of thousands of neurons over whatever time it takes you to do something interesting. So you can imagine that's like a huge amount of information. But what neuroscientists generally want to look at is, first of all, just the amount of activity. So we generally think of different neurons as being responsible for different types of tasks. So for example, processing visual input or deciding on certain actions that you want to carry out and so on. I think if you wanted to really get into that, that's not exactly right. I think each neuron does a lot of different things at the same time, but overall this is true. So it's definitely important to know which neurons are active or less active at each moment in time. But then you can also look at the pattern of this activity, specifically the rhythm, which is usually referred to as oscillations. So a lot of the time neurons are kind of active and not active at the same time. So the activity comes in waves, and those waves can happen at different time scales and in different relation to each other. Which brings us to the third point, which is coordination, often referred to as synchrony or as functional connectivity. So this means that two groups of neurons or two brain areas might be more or less linked in the timing of their activity and therefore be more or less able to communicate activity to each other in an efficient way. Now, this is what we want to know, but of course, in order to know that, we need to measure it. And so in the rest of the talk, I'll refer to studies both in animals and in humans. And the really important thing to keep in mind is that in animals, we're really able to directly capture the activity of neurons, either by using electrodes that we stick into the brain and that directly look at the electrical activity of lots of different neurons, or by using, for example, 2-photon imaging, which basically is a microscope where all the neurons that are active show up in sort of a fluorescent green. And again, you have these kind of traces of activity for each neuron. Now, both of these techniques mean that you have a direct, unambiguous picture of the activity of these neurons, which means that you can look at, for example, the amount and the rhythm and the coordination of activity all independently of each other and in a very specific way. Now, this is not the case for human studies, of course, because for very obvious reasons, we're not great fans of putting holes in the skulls of people. So one of the main things that we do in humans is EEG. Interesting. Okay, let's just leave it like this. What you get out then is basically the overall electrical activity of very large groups of neurons, which looks kind of like this, very squiggly. And if you want, you can then look at this on different time scales. So you can look at only the very, very fast activity or only the very, very slow activity. But what's very important to know is that because this is an electrical signal, it doesn't have an absolute zero. It's always referring to another electrical signal. So what this means is that when you see a squiggle that's either bigger or smaller, let's say you see a very small squiggle, that could be because no neurons are active, or because all the neurons are active, but they're all active in a very sort of flat way. So there you have definitely a bit of a mix-up between the amount and the rhythm of activity. And the same goes for the second really big technique that we use in humans, which is the Fmri. So you put people in a magnetic scanner and you use that to detect the so-called Bolt signal, which is the amount of oxygenated blood that flows to a certain area in the brain. And normally that's taken to mean that this area is very active, so therefore it needs more oxygenated blood. But it's actually also been shown that the Bolt signal does not only reflect the amount of activity, it also reflects when neurons are active in a very rhythmic kind of way. So again, we have a bit of a mix-up. So that's always important to notice when we're talking about human studies. So these are the general neuroscientific tools that we're going to look at. Let's apply them to the neuroscience of breathing. So let's first talk about what happens when you're just normally breathing. Nothing special, just what you do all day. What does that do to your brain? Well, first of all, breathing shapes the oscillations, so the rhythmic activity in olfactory cortex. So that's the part of the cortex that's responsible for your sense of smell, which is maybe not all that surprising. So this is now in rodents. So this is with electrodes in rodents, and what you see here is the breathing cycle of this animal. So you can imagine when the animal is exploring, then it's breathing a little bit faster, it's sniffing a lot to kind of find out what the environment is like, whereas at rest here, this breathing cycle is very, very slow. And when you look at the activity in the olfactory cortex, you see that it tracks this activity really well, right? So it's very, very closely tied to the breathing cycle. But in a way, that's not very surprising because if you're trying to understand, for example, the smells that come in, it makes sense that the olfactory cortex is a lot more active during the inhale because that's when all the interesting information comes in. So this still makes a lot of sense in a very simple kind of way. But then when you look further and you actually record over lots and lots of different areas all across the brain that are responsible for completely different things. So vision, your skin sense, your memory, your motor output, all sorts of things, then all of these you can see are also tied to the breathing cycle. So this is again the breathing cycle during rest and during expiration. And you see that all these areas, different areas, are quite tightly related. And interestingly, so you see here that there's this kind of tiny delay. So this means that the breathing does not entrain all of these areas in exactly the same way like little soldiers, but rather that the breathing is kind of a rhythm that all these areas lock to in different ways. So that's very interesting, but it could just happen in rodents because they're so olfaction driven, right? The sense of smell is much more important to a mouse than to a human. So maybe this doesn't happen in humans. But that's not the case. So when you look in humans, interestingly, this is actually a study where there were electrodes in the brain of human patients because they needed this for clinical reasons. And so then people were recording activity, again, in completely different brain areas So prefrontal cortex, amygdala, hippocampus. So this is memory, fear, behavioral control, if you want to keep it a bit simple. And you see again, so in red, you have the breathing cycle, and each of these areas has a very clear peak in activity that's related to the breathing. And very interestingly, that only happens when you breathe through your nose. So this is how it looks when you breathe through your nose, and this is how it looks when the same people breathe through their mouth. And there's actually nothing at all related to the breath, really. So that's a very interesting difference. Now the question is, okay, so at least nasal breathing seems to definitely give a rhythm to the activity in the brain. But does this actually matter? Does this actually affect how you process the world? And yes, it does. So interestingly, while you inhale, it seems that people are generally a little bit better at cognitive processing. So here's a cute example of that. Here, people got shown these kind of little visual, sort of complicated cubes, and had to decide if another cube is the same one, but from a different angle, or if it's a different cube. And you see here, so this is % accurate during exhale and during inhale, and all this is in the lower triangle, which means that people were generally more accurate during the inhale. And you see this for other domains also, so people are better at decoding emotional facial expressions, and also better at all facets of memory. So both encoding the memory, keeping it in mind, and then also retrieving the memory, all works better during the inhale. Which leaves the question, what is the exhale doing? Well, the exhale seems to be quite good at preparing you for action. So this does not go for reactive movements. So let's say like a tennis ball is flying towards you and you catch it, you don't care what type of the breathing cycle you're in. But if you're initiating an action, let's say you're reaching for a water glass, that's a lot more likely to happen while you're exhaling. And this goes along with a very different structure in the connectivity and the activity of the brain as measured by EEG. So in a way, you can sort of, obviously this is fuzzy. It's not that, for example, you can't memorize anything while you're exhaling, or it's not like you can't make any movements when you're inhaling. But it's kind of nice to think of it as this little dance where like you inhale, you sense, you exhale, you act, right? So it's a nice little cycle. So conclusions about normal breath in the brain. First of all, natural breathing does shape the rhythm of neural activity, both across brain areas and across species. And this really affects cognition. So sensory processing works better during the inhale and action preparation better during the exhale. And very interestingly, in humans, this effect is a lot stronger when you breathe through your nose than through your mouth. Now, this raises the question, how can we use these interesting properties of breathing, like for example, the synchronizing effect, when we're using a conscious breathing technique? And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation. And I'm going to focus on 3 different techniques. So obviously there's a huge range of breathing techniques, but just to keep it less confusing, and also to just talk about the techniques that I've at least experienced a little bit by myself, so that I have a feeling of, you know, what the experience is really like. I'm going to talk about 3, which I think are also nicely complementary to each other in terms of what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve. So one is slow breath meditation, one is the Wim Hof Method, and one is breathwork, which is referred to as holotropic or connective or rebirthing. And so for each of these breathing techniques, I'll go into sort of how they work, what their aim and their rationality is, and then what the neuronal changes are typically, both during the breathing and then in the long term. Right. If there are any questions that would be useful to answer right now, then let me know. Then we can do that in between before we go to this part. Okay, right now I don't see any raised hands, so that's good. Then let's keep going. Let's talk about meditation. Well, first of all, meditation is obviously an interesting case because it's not just the breath, right? It's also the way you focus your attention in certain ways. So it's definitely all the effects that you're seeing are not just because of the breathing; they're also because of that. But in general, right now we're looking at quite a simple form of meditation, so we can assume that a lot of it does actually come down to the breathing. So here I'm only including studies that use kind of a slow, controlled breathing rhythm, and then focus either on the breath itself or just on scanning your body for sensations. And a very typical approach that people start with when they're practicing meditation would be count 4 on the in-breath through the nose, and then count 8 on the out-breath, either through your nose or mouth, and then just scan how your body feels. So the way this would look is, right, and then you keep going. So as you're practicing this type of meditation, typically what happens to people is that you go kind of through several stages of practice. So at the early stage, a lot of things are just very annoying. So you keep losing count of your breath, your leg might fall asleep, you might notice a mosquito in the room. It's just all very effortful. And then you get to a more advanced stage where the main thing you're doing is to notice when your mind wandering and keep your attention back onto the breath. And then as you go even further, you might hopefully reach a stage where the main thing you do is kind of to drop into just being and not really doing very much else. Right. Origin, well, very, very long ago. So long ago that it's actually really hard to determine. What we know is that there's Indian wall art from about 5000 BC, which already shows different meditative postures. And of course, meditation is very much associated to Buddha, but actually Buddha very explicitly did not invent it at all. In fact, the Buddhist teachings mention teachers that taught him meditation. So this is very, very old. And the rationality is essentially that if you keep following your breath, you stop identifying with the specific contents of your awareness. So, you know, my shopping list, and this is who I am, and this is what I need to do, and this is what happened to me today, and this is what happened to me 10 years ago. And instead just go into this, what one could call pure embodied awareness of I am here, I am breathing. And realize that for this awareness, you don't actually need contents of your thinking all the time. The effects that are generally mentioned and also by now pretty well documented is that you have an improved attentional focus, you're more relaxed, more self-aware, there's a heightened ability to regulate your emotions, especially your negative emotions. People have a more positive baseline mood kind of throughout their everyday life, and also a reduced pain perception or a higher pain threshold. Okay, so what happens to the brain while you're doing this meditative breathing? Well, a nice way of looking at it is, so you can look at the where, so where does activity happen, and also at the how, so how does this activity actually look? And this is a very nice study by Havenith et al., who actually looked at the different stages of meditation. So let's say you're focusing on your breath, you're breathing, then your mind starts to wander, then you become aware that your mind is wandering, then you shift your focus back onto the breath, right? And for each of these different stages, they actually identified different locations in the brain that light up, which I'm not going to go into too deeply, but if you're interested in it, it's a very nice study. The one I'm going to mention is the default mode network, which is active here during mind wandering, and it's going to come up a couple of times in the talk, because the way you can look at it is it's basically a network of areas in the brain that is active when you're kind of idling and maintaining your status quo and kind of just going like, okay, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing right now, and just kind of mind wandering and not really questioning what you're doing. And it turns out that a lot of breathing techniques switch off the default mode network in one way or another. So in terms of how that activity looks that's happening in those different brain areas, you see quite a lot of rhythm shifts across the brain in terms of oscillations. So this is very nice. Here you see that neural activity gets synchronized both across the brain and also with the heart rate and with the breathing, particularly when you're breathing at a speed of around 6 breaths per minute. So 1 breath every 10 seconds. So here you see the EEG traces of the brain when people do different breathing speeds between a 6-second rhythm and a 12-second or 14-second rhythm. And you see that especially at around 10 seconds, the brain gets really, really synchronized, right? That's the red color. And interestingly, that doesn't happen when you, for example, clap your hands every 10 seconds. So it's not about just doing anything in a certain rhythm. It's really about the breathing. So in this synchronized state, you also see increased oscillations at the range of about 10 hertz, so 10 waves per second. And you see decrease in other oscillation frequencies, and especially again in this default mode network that I mentioned. Now, what happens to the brain when you practice meditative breathing long term? A couple of very interesting things. As I said, this is kind of probably the most scientifically well-documented technique so far. So there's really a lot of changes that have been shown, but the main ones are that you have increased activation and connectivity for areas of cognitive and emotional control and introspection. So the big ones are cingulate cortex, pre- and orbitofrontal cortex, and insula. And you have reduced activity of the amygdala, which is typically thought to mediate emotions like fear and anger. And interestingly, you also have a stronger connection between amygdala and those areas of emotional control. So it's basically as if the processing of fear and anger is more embedded in a bigger network of regulation. You have an increased control of the default mode network. That means the default mode network can switch on and off more flexibly. You have an increased cortical thickness, an improved immune response, and also a decreased variability of the heart rate. So your heart rate is more steady, and you also have decreased cortisol levels, so decreased levels of stress hormones. And obviously these two, I just wanted to highlight them again, because again, this speaks to this idea that you're not just changing your brain, you're also changing your autonomic nervous system. Right, conclusions about slow breath meditation. So slow breath meditation definitely seems to make use of the synchronizing power of the breath that we already saw in normal breathing. And during the meditation, a lot of brain areas are broadly synchronized, both with each other and with heart rate and breathing. And the networks of emotional and cognitive regulation are very active. And over time, this seems to increase the broad connectivity of the brain with these regulating areas, and it decreases the drive to areas that process fear, anger, and mind wandering. Okay. Again, this is a good time for questions before we go to the next breathing technique. Okay.
You can also write your questions into the question and answers during the talk. So
yeah, exactly. Just if there's something right now that people are really not getting that are very important, then now is a good time. Otherwise, we go on to the Wim Hof Method. So the Wim Hof Method is a little bit more specific. So what you do is you have about 30 to 40 really deep breaths, really deep into your belly, through your mouth, and ideally the in-breath will be a little bit longer. Then after the last out-breath, you hold your breath as long as you can. Then you breathe in once, then you hold your breath again for a little while, and then you repeat that whole thing 3 times. So I'll just give you an extremely shortened version of this with like a couple of deep breaths and then a little bit of breath holding. So the way this would look is like hold, hold, hold. Let's pretend that this is as long as I can hold the breath right now. Breathe in, hold again for a little bit, and then you start breathing again in a very intense way. And this is very often practiced together with exposure to cold. So ice baths, hikes on very cold mountains and things like that. Now, the origin is this was developed by the so-called Iceman Wim Hof. It's partially based on traditions like the Tummo tradition in Tibet that I mentioned, and also the pranayama from India. But mainly it seems to have been developed really intuitively by Wim Hof. So the story he tells us that his wife was very deeply depressed. She had very, very bad, very clinical depression, and she committed suicide, and he was left alone with his 4 children and was obviously having a very, very hard time, was very desperate to himself get better and maybe also to find something that might have helped his wife. And so at some point he was taking this walk in the morning and saw this cold lake and thought, oh, it would be really great to jump into this cold lake, and just did it. And when he did that, he intuitively, just, as a physical reaction, started these really deep breaths, right? And he felt that this was really doing him some good in some way. And so from there, he kind of intuitively, really by feeling into his body, developed this whole sequence of breaths, and also this idea of cold exposure. And then started seeing that his body was really changing, and that also his emotional stability was really changing. The rationality of this is not really any. So Wim Hof, so breathe, motherfucker. Wim Hof seems to be not a fan of explaining why and how things work in this way. And I actually have a little video that I'm going to show you, first of all, because I think it's very entertaining, and second of all, because it's very nice to hear this in his own words. Yes.
When we were in the river,
yes.
and I was in the river, I was cold, like I'm telling you, right, okay, I'm cold now. You're saying, I was expecting you were going to say, right, breathe in through the right nostril, block the left nostril, now exhale through the mouth, now hold, pull the Mula Bandha, tighten Adhyana Bandha. I was thinking, it's going to be very prescriptive. Go again! He's not taught me the techniques yet. Teach me! But you said instead, no, just be in the cold. Be in the cold. And then
let your body do what the body is able to do.
And in this moment, I recognized that, because I said to you also, what shall I do? Where shall I put the attention? Don't put it nowhere. Don't put the attention nowhere.
Yes.
Other things I remember from this brief experience, when we were doing, is that Tai Chi we were doing on the shore? What were we doing?
No, it just came up with that.
You came up with that as improvised Tai Chi.
Actually,
I don't know what that was. I was just moving around.
Once I had no toilet and I had to do my poopy. So I had to stand in this awkward position. They call it a horse stance. The Shina Bandha Bumba posture, asanas. What?
So he's clearly not a fan of overthinking things. So he just came up with this. It felt right, and it turned out that it worked. So now the effects of this are actually really quite interesting. So you have a much improved immune response, decreased inflammation, which is also important for people, for example, with arthritis and things like that. And you have an up to now basically undocumented control over your autonomic nervous system. And it's definitely pushing the boundaries of what we would normally consider human fitness. So for example, to make this a bit more concrete, this is Wim Hof climbing the Himalaya without a t-shirt. And at first people thought, well, he's just like a crazy freak of nature. He probably has some kind of genetic alteration. But then he taught other people the breathing techniques, and they can do it too. So this seems to be really something that the breath does. Now, how does this work? What happens during the breathing? Well, first of all, during these active breathing phases, when you're breathing very strongly, the O2 in your blood goes up and the CO2 goes down. So hyperoxygenation and hypocapnia. And that leads to what's called respiratory alkalosis, and that will come up a couple of times also later in holotropic breathwork. So what this means is that your blood pH value changes to a more alkaline one. And so then when you're holding your breath, you actually go the other way. So your O2 goes very much down, your CO2 goes up. And this is kind of how it looks. So when you have these three phases of breathing, very active breathing, no breathing, very active breathing, no breathing, then what happens is that first of all, so here you're completely, the O2 saturation of your blood is complete, like it's 100%, then it goes down, then you have to breathe again, then it goes down again. And you see here that the tolerance to sinking O2 levels really goes up through this technique, right? So at first you can only tolerate like 90%, then you go to 70, then you go to 50. And similarly here, the heart rate, the first time you breathe very intensely, the heart rate really goes up, and then it starts kind of normalizing. And so what happens overall when you do this is that you have increased cortisol release during this time of breathing, and also increased release of catecholamines, so that's epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that means that you're activating your sympathetic nervous system. So that's the system that's usually called fight or flight. Now, what happens long-term? So there's two ways to look at this. First of all, in terms of the brain, the nervous system, and the second in terms of the immune system. So let's start with the nervous system. So first of all, you seem to be able to more flexibly regulate the cortical control, especially as it comes to pain perception. So this is a study where they scanned both Wim Hof and control subjects in an Fmri scanner. And what they saw was that there's only a couple of areas that are really different. One is the PAG, which is here in the brainstem, and it's thought of as being the gate to pain perception. So basically pain signals come up from your spine, and then the PAG decides whether to pass them on to the cortex. And it also releases endocannabinoids, so basically natural painkillers. And what you see here is that, so the blue line is from normal people, and the red is from Wim Hof. And you see here, these were periods where his body was cooled down. And this brain area is just more flexible, right? So it's actually less active during normal times, but more active during cooling, right? So this gating mechanism seems to be more strongly engaged. And similarly here, so the insula, which is responsible for interoception, so your awareness of your body, and also for pain judgment. So not the feeling of pain, but judging, oh, is this very bad now, or is it not so bad? And again, so this area is less active in Wim Hof, but again, you can see that this is mainly down to the flexibility. So again, blue lines is normal people, red line is Wim Hof. So this area is normally more active, but during these cooling periods, it's less active in Wim Hof. And then finally, in terms of the sympathetic nervous system, we actually see that there's new growth of nerve endings around the lung muscles. And what this seems to do is that when Wim Hof, or people who use this technique, when you're experiencing cold exposure, these little sympathetic nerve endings make the muscles around the lung sort of shiver a little bit, which gives enough body heat to preserve the core body heat of your lungs and heart. And that may be one of the ways in which you can withstand cold a lot more. Now, let's have a look what happens to the immune system. Well, first of all, let's see if this is actually true, or if it's just sort of a subjective idea that the immune system gets better. So here, there are two studies that actually made this test. And what they did was they gave a so-called immune challenge. So what this means is that they basically injected people with reasonably mild bacteria of the type of E. coli, which normally will give you a little bit of fever, a little bit of nausea, and so on for, let's say, about a day. And then the first thing they just did was to look at the symptoms that people had. Here's the symptom score. So in this little line, this is the control. And here, these are trained people. And you see that the symptom scores are much, much lower for people who are doing the Wim Hof method. How does this happen? Why can they deal so much better with an immune challenge? What seems to happen is that so they release both epinephrine and norepinephrine more strongly after an immune challenge. So this is what you see here. These are the trained people. These are the untrained people. Trained people, untrained people. And they also have a lower cortisol response. So this is what you see here. And because of that, you have increased anti-inflammatory signal and decreased inflammatory signaling through so-called interleukins or cytokines. So this seems to be the mechanism. What can we take from all this? Well, first of all, the Wim Hof method confronts the body with really challenging physiological states, both in terms of the cold, but also just in the breathing through this constant change between hyper and hyperoxygenation of the blood and the respiratory alkalosis. And during the breath, this actually raises cortisol levels and activates the sympathetic nervous system. But then over time, it first of all increases the innervation of sympathetic nerve fibers and upregulates the control areas in the brain that determine pain perception. But also it decreases your cortisol levels in the long term and increases epinephrine and norepinephrine release, which boosts anti-inflammatory signaling. Right. Again, if there are no urgent questions, then we will go to the final breathing technique. And that's connective holotropic or rebirthing breathwork. So first, how does it work? It's actually deceptively simple. So usually you breathe through your mouth. ideally while lying down. That's just most comfortable. And the way you do that is you have a long and deep in-breath into your belly, and then a fast, relaxed out-breath. So I should say this, so all these breathing techniques are really quite similar, but I'm nevertheless mainly talking about connective breathwork because that's what I know most. And then the important bit is that you don't pause your breathing. So you have a circular breathing. So the way it looks is kind of like this. And then you keep doing that for anywhere between half an hour, an hour. Some people actually like to do this several hours. And a lot of the time you do this with a guide or sitter. Where does it come from? Well, it was developed independently by Stan Grof and Leonard Orr in the 1960s. And actually one of the motivations for them to look at different breathing techniques was to find a legal alternative for the psychedelic experience. Because back then this was just about the time where things like LSD were becoming illegal, and they were basically saying, okay, what can you not make illegal? It's breathing, right? The breath is always with you, so let's find ways of giving people that type of experience without them having to swallow anything. So the rationale is basically that this kind of deep circular breathing is actually quite natural to people, but it often gets disturbed by trauma or stress. And so one of the ways to look at this is that by restoring this kind of natural deep breath cycle, you're creating space for embodied healing, for healing not just in your thoughts, but actually also in the way you feel your body. And to expand on this a little bit, the way you can look at it is that, so let's say there's some kind of emotional trauma or stress in your life, this will probably lead to strained breathing. So both at the time, so this is actually also what happens in animals. When something very shocking happens, you freeze, right? You stop moving, you stop breathing. But also if you keep these emotions, and if you might be suppressing these emotions, you might still be breathing in a sort of strange, shallow way. And this will lead to physical symptoms, like, for example, high blood pressure, slightly lower O2 levels in the blood, nothing that would send you to the hospital, but still slightly generally lower O2 levels, slightly higher CO2 levels. And that has actually been shown to also change the neurotransmitter release in your brain by, for example, lowering serotonin, which in turn, you can imagine, again, contributes to more emotional stress. And so the idea is that breathwork would cut this cycle. Right. What do you experience when you do breathwork? Lots and lots of different things. It changes for different people. It changes for different sessions. But here are some of the typical things. So especially at the start of the session, lots of people might feel like little pins and needles or a little bit of dizziness. Then you can feel altered sensory perception or heightened sensory perception. Physical actions, so your body just wants to move in a certain way. Some people make sounds, or some people even jump up or dance or whatever. Then the visions I talked about, again, not hallucinations, but sort of a visual form of cognition, and eureka moments where sort of different things find their way together and suddenly start making sense. Resurfacing memories. So actually one of the reasons that this is also called rebirthing is because some people believe that you can actually retrieve extremely early memories from very early childhood, from even as a baby. So that's why it's called rebirthing. So you're basically re-experiencing your birth, possibly. Then very intense emotions can come up, and a general feeling of being more open and more vulnerable. Over the long term, there have been at least a good handful of studies now that have really shown that this can help with processing and integrating trauma, that it can decrease quite dramatically anxiety, PTSD, addiction, and depression, that it leads to additional well-being to other forms of therapy, and also to increased self-awareness and sort of authentic self-expression. Now, how does this look in the brain? As I might have mentioned at the start of this, breathwork is definitely the technique that has been least studied in a sort of really neuroscientific way. But what we know so far is that, so you have increased O2 levels, lowered CO2 levels in your blood, which again, like also the Wim Hof method, leads to respiratory alkalosis, so alkaline blood. And what we also know is that over time, this leads to decreased activity in frontal cortex in your brain, and to a very dynamic alteration of oscillatory rhythms of activity all across the brain. And this actually depends on your specific experience. So you kind of have fingerprints of rhythmic activity all over your brain, but those fingerprints will look extremely different if, for example, someone is moving a lot or re-experiencing a childhood trauma, or, you know, finding energy and joy or whatever. So there's a lot of different fingerprints, but you can definitely see them. Now, the really interesting question is, what's the middle step? How do you go from alkaline blood to all these different oscillations? And this has definitely not been proven, but there's some very interesting hints. So the first one is that there seems to be a slowdown of blood flow, especially to frontal cortex, which might also explain why there's decreased activity there. That's not particularly strange. But the other thing that has been proposed is that one of the reasons why breathwork can have such dramatic effects is because you release endogenous DMT in your brain. And the mechanism by which this might happen is that basically an alkaline blood pH is a sort of near-death signal, right? So usually if you behave normally, alkaline blood will only happen when something is going seriously wrong in your body. So this might be one of those triggers for the release of DMT close to death. And so this release of DMT close to death part has actually been shown in one study, one sort of not very friendly study, where they took rats, and some of them they just decapitated extremely quickly, and then they looked at the brains and tried to find DMT. And then the other group of rats, they gave a heart attack first. And then once the rats were dead, they also looked for DMT, and they saw that the rats with a heart attack actually had a pretty seriously high concentration of DMT in their brain, which was close to the levels of other neurotransmitters. So you could assume that this might be enough to actually really have an effect on your perception. So in this case, if this is true, this would basically put the effects of the more intense effects of breathwork on the same level as a psychedelic experience or a near-death experience. For people who have experienced breathwork, this makes sense to some extent, because indeed it subjectively can feel very similar to a psychedelic experience. So in that sense, that from the subjective point of view, that makes sense. But in terms of really looking at the brain mechanisms of this, we don't know yet. Right. Oh, I cannot hear you. I think you have to thingy your mic. Yes.
Sorry, could you briefly answer one question from the audience?
Sure.
Somebody asking, what is endogenous DMT?
Oh, sorry. So that's basically just DMT that's produced in your own brain. That's DMT that you're not having to take. So that's produced by some kind of gland in your brain. And actually, people are not yet sure where it comes from. A lot of people think it's from the pineal gland right here. But this study showed that this is not the case, because when you take the pineal gland out of the rat, then this still works. Right. So what happens long term when you do breathwork more or less regularly? The short answer is nobody really knows. There have been no studies on long-term brain changes with breathwork practice, as far as I know. I've looked quite intensely and I haven't found anything. But again, there's some intriguing kind of hints. So this is a very nice study by Campbell-Sills, who first of all looked at people's tendency to suppress their negative emotions. So they just gave them a questionnaire with things like, it's not okay to cry in public, and questions like that. And based on the scores in this questionnaire, they put people in groups of either low, moderate, or high suppressors. And then they showed them a very emotionally evocative movie, and had a look, again with a questionnaire, at how much negative emotion people were experiencing, either directly after the movie or a couple of days later. And you see that the high suppressors are the ones who experience the most negative emotion, both directly after the movie and also later. So this would a little bit psychologically explain this idea that by suppressing your emotions, you're actually increasing the anxiety and depression that you experience. And one can imagine that breathwork might actually tackle this kind of mechanism and release this kind of control on negative emotions. So here, this is put very nicely by Reinwein and Williams. So what they say is, we believe that the altered consciousness induced by prolonged voluntary hyperventilation involves a process of exposure to feared internal affective stimuli in the context of a supportive therapeutic setting, with resulting extinction of covert avoidance behaviors. So if you want to put this in sort of simpler language, what it really means is you're facing things that you're actually afraid of or that you think are going to be extremely painful, but you're doing it in a supportive setting. And by doing that, you extinguish your tendency to constantly run away from those things. And this process of relatively sudden behavioral change is subjectively experienced by patients as catharsis. So again, this is obviously just a psychological description of what people seem to feel and experience. So what's really still missing is the brain data. Based on these descriptions, what I would assume you would see if you looked at the brain of people who do breathwork long term is that you would see changes in the amygdala in terms of fear, processing fear, anger, and so on, in frontal cortices, so actually the control areas that might also be the ones that are making the decision to suppress certain things, and also in the default mode network. So the sort of mind wandering, this is who I am, keeping the status quo alive kind of network. Right, conclusions. Breathwork increases the O2 and decreases the CO2 in your blood, which produces a more alkaline blood pH. And this, in some way or other, invokes an altered state of consciousness, which includes the suppression of activity in frontal cortex and also extremely altered overall oscillatory patterns across the brain. And it seems that in the state, suppressed emotions or insights can be integrated into consciousness more easily. And this seems to very robustly decrease things like anxiety and depression. And one way of interpreting that is that there's a cycle of trauma to strained breathing to physiological and emotional stress, and breathwork breaks that cycle. Right, overall conclusions. Brain and breath are intricately intertwined. They're basically sort of a closed feedback loop. Both influence each other extremely strongly, but science has only just started to decipher how that works. And conscious breathing techniques directly affect your brain activity in ways that can by now be measured. And so therefore, I would say that conscious breathing is definitely an ally and a tool in shaping the way you interact with the world, and it's very much worth using. Right, resources if you want to dig deeper into this. There's a couple of really good books, one by Stanislav Grof about holotropic breathwork, one more general one about embodied experience of trauma by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. And if you're into this idea that breathwork releases DMT, then there's Rick Strassman's book for you, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. Then there's a couple of really good blogs and videos. Breathworkscience.org is generally a good one. And the one I'm referencing here is a really nice blog post by Lloyd Lalonde. So that's really nice. And if you're really interested and you want to kind of jump into the actual practical experience, there's a lot of breathwork practitioners everywhere. The ones I'm showing here are reasonably random. This is my website, so that's that. This is my teacher's website, Adam and Stem and L, if you're in the Netherlands, that might interest you, and the website of the Wim Hof Method. And of course, you can always contact me for specific questions. Right.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you for the wonderful talk. So this is a lot of stuff to discuss. And before we get into the questions of the audience, let me just ask one special question. Do we know about other mammals or apes that intentionally use breath to change something, their behavior, their states? And maybe associated with that, can you think of an evolutionary advantage of doing that?
That's a very good question. I think the example that people come up with, but again, this seems to be one of those that has not been studied in any serious way, is that animals, when they've been in a very stressful situation, so at first they freeze or they escape, right? But then after this is over, you see this kind of very deep breathing and trembling. And that seems to be a sort of way of normalizing the physiological state again. So I think that's the closest thing that I can see to breathwork. And in a way, that's what we're kind of trying to do in the breathwork, is to, what maybe people don't do after a very traumatic experience, is this, is kind of getting it out of your system, right? Yeah, but I think that's the closest thing I can think of.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, well, what's the next research study that needs to be done on breath work, on these forms of holotropic or immersive breath work? What do you think would clarify something that we don't know the best?
Well, I think actually, so there's a couple of things you can do. So there's at least a couple of clinical studies, so that's good, right? Where you kind of look at anxiety levels, depression levels, and so on. But the most obvious thing would be to put people in a scanner, in an Fmri scanner, and really look at how the brain is active. And also, I think it would be very interesting to see how the brain is active in response, for example, to emotional stimuli. So if we believe, for example, that breathwork makes it easier to be open to, for example, negative emotions, then this would definitely show up on a scan. That would be very interesting.
Okay, so Irene is asking, if breathwork is meant to put you in a state similar to fear response, what do you think would be the difference between a holotropic breathwork state and a real fear-based response?
Okay. Actually, it's not about being in a fear state, right? That's very important. And actually, one important thing to realize is that it's very different from hyperventilation. Like, people call it hyperventilation just because that means very strong breathing. But for example, when you're hyperventilating out of fear, you're breathing very shallow. So what actually happens is the opposite. So for example, your oxygen goes way down in your blood. So breathwork kind of does the opposite. It's not inducing, for example, a fear response. It's actually inducing a very deep state where you can re-experience a fear that happened before. So this is, and thereby you can integrate it. So you're re-experiencing something, but you're re-experiencing it actually in the context of relaxation and of openness. So in a weird way, yes, you are potentially re-experiencing emotions, but it's actually the opposite setting, both in terms of the psychology, right? You're in a supportive setting, and even physiologically, because this deep, fast breathing is the opposite of fear-based breathing.
Yeah. So how evidence-based is the DMT release thesis that you've been referring to? Is that just a speculation? There's a lot of fringe going on in that field.
I think it's really just this one study, like literally one study about the rats with a heart attack by Rick Strassman. So that's really cool, and that's also, I think, really dependable. But that's really all I've found. I think the main reason why people believe this to be quite solid is because it feels so similar, right? And that's actually, I think that's a valid data point, right? But this will need a lot more study. This is definitely not proven at all.
Yeah. So Johan asks, holotropic breathwork is often done with music, or it's regularly done with music.
Yes.
With and without music, the same results? That's his questions.
Well, that's a really difficult one. I don't think it's necessarily the same result. I think you can definitely do breathwork without music, but with music, it's a lot easier. I think there's a couple of factors. So first of all, music, funny enough, also synchronizes the brain, right? So that's actually another sort of neurological way of getting more brain areas to talk to each other. So in a way, you do the breathwork and the music, and it kind of doubles the effect of, crosstalk between all your brain areas. I think that's one sort of neuroscience-based way of looking at it. And I think the other thing is sort of from a more psychological point of view, you're really not in a verbal state, right? So if, for example, you have a guide and that guide says, think of something sad, that's not going to work. That's not at all the level you're at. So in a way, music is also kind of a non-verbal way of instructing the types of things you might want to look at, right? Or also, now it's the really intense phase of the session and now we're going to start relaxing. You can communicate all these things through music without having to say them. And that's very useful because while you're breathing, you want to do as little verbal processing as possible, I would say.
Yeah. So some practitioner questions, or also people who have not experienced breathwork yet. Is breathwork used in psychotherapeutic settings, or is it only being researched on? And somebody also asks, is it safe to self-medicate with breathwork?
I would generally say yes, in the sense that, especially with breathwork, if something gets too intense, you just stop breathing, and within like a minute, you're back to your normal state, right? So that's one way of looking at it. I think for a lot of people, it can be harder when you're doing breathwork on your own to let down your defenses, right? Because there's always a thing that's aware, okay, I'm alone. So if I freak out completely, there's no one to hold me, right? So it's harder to let down your defenses. It's definitely possible. The final thing is you should definitely assess kind of how well you know yourself, how much stuff you've looked at in yourself, how much stuff you haven't looked at all, and how much integration that might need, right? So I think with all of these things, with psychedelic experiences, also with breathwork, integration is incredibly important. So afterwards, having someone to interpret the experience with, to kind of bounce feelings off, is extremely important. So if you're at a point where you know yourself well, you can sort of self-guide. That's no problem. If you think there might still be stuff coming up that you have no idea what to do with, then you should definitely go with a guide first.
So another question that we get is how is it explainable that people have so hugely different experiences while using the same method so some people who might not have witnessed or have done a session themselves do not know that at all, but people come up with very different experiences. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So the experiences are extremely different between people, but also extremely different from session to session. And what, many practitioners would say, you get what you need, right? And I also very strongly believe in that. And I think the way to look at it in a sort of neuroscientific way is that the main thing these experiences do is they connect your brain areas. So they let brain areas talk to each other that normally don't communicate all that much. And they make your brain more plastic, so more changeable, right? So what that means is that, for example, if one brain area of yours is holding a conviction or whatever that conflicts with another brain area, by having them communicate, this conflict gets resolved potentially. And so that's why basically anything can happen, because it depends on what needs to be resolved in your brain at this specific time. That's how I would see it. So it's really, I think, for example, a lot of the classical treatments that are used in psychiatry, for example, antidepressants, have a very clear goal. We want more serotonin in the brain. Like it's one thing that you really want to do, whereas this just kind of opens up the field for whatever change needs to happen.
Yeah. So, Martha, you're not a psychotherapist, but obviously you're into breathwork counseling and you're interested in behavioral change in the broadest sense. So when we look at the history of psychotherapy, it's in the West, it started as a talking cure, then we got those behavioral methods, a training cure, if you want to. And now a lot is happening in the space of changing or getting patients into psychedelic states or into more into altered states of consciousness and combining that with behavioral methods. Is breathwork a candidate for becoming a psychotherapy in the West, or what do you think, if not, keeps it from becoming such a candidate?
I think so. I think it's definitely a candidate, and that also goes into this notion that therapy has to become more embodied, right? And I feel like that's also sort of like a current in the development of psychotherapies, that you can't just fix the thinking, you can't just fix the behavior, you have to fix the entire sort of physical response to certain things. So I think actually breathwork is kind of a nice way of doing this, actually maybe a bit easier in psychedelics, because A, you're not taking anything, and B, it combines actually very well with, for example, talk therapy of either kind, right? So it's just a way of sort of possibly opening up certain themes more quickly, more easily.
Yeah. Some people seem to be turned off by clients or patients potentially. Let's put it a little bit colloquially, freaking out in front of the therapist or freaking out. So actually, for those who haven't seen it, some people have real extreme bodily movements when breathing, when re-experiencing these states. So what do you think has to happen to make that more acceptable to therapists?
That's such a good question. I feel a little bit like this is anyways one of the things that makes sort of Western cultures a little bit crazy is, you know, like on average, is this kind of trying to exclude the darker parts of life, basically, in all sorts of ways, right?
Darker in the sense of?
In sense of negative emotions, pain, discomfort, uncertainty. I mean, even physically, we just don't like discomfort, right?
Or just losing control. I mean,
exactly right.
Control is exactly what you don't want when you're in a rationalist society where you have plans and you follow the plans and you, yeah.
Exactly right. So we're already freaking out when, you know, a train is half an hour late or whatever, right? So this is kind of the level of control we like to have of our life, right?
Only in Germany.
Poor Germans. Yeah, I think this is generally maybe one of the things that's kind of like a common, well, I don't want to put it too strongly, but let's say a common neurosis in Western cultures is that we have such a hard time letting the darker parts of life in. And I think the best way to counter that is if, for example, therapists themselves have experiences like this and realize how incredibly freeing it can be to face the darkness that almost every life has in one way or another, and to just say it's actually okay to experience that and to not push it away and to not interpret it either.
Let's talk about the darker sides for a minute. Irene is asking the question, are there cases of people who experience depersonalization or psychosis during or after breathwork?
I have not seen that in breathwork. I think it's still a small danger, but it's more of a danger in psychedelic experiences. Again, because you're taking something. I think the reason why this doesn't seem to happen much in breathwork is because you're physically active in your body. So just by virtue of having to breathe so strongly, it's actually very hard to dissociate from the experience. And the other thing is because if it really feels like there's something really overwhelming coming up, you will stop breathing, right? But yeah, I think in that sense, breathwork is actually like, it has a sort of nice self-controlling mechanism in it.
Yeah, so there are actually quite a number of case studies where people got into psychosis also in breathwork context. But of course, you have to look at the risk relationship of how many people are doing it, and if people are already coming in a vulnerable state. So there are cases that are reported and people report. So that might relate to another question that we get: is it safe to self-medicate? Of course, is it safe to self-medicate?
Yes.
If you're in a vulnerable state, it's wise to have a empathetic human being close to you, and better have a trained human being close to you. I think that's a thing that everybody could say in a therapeutic context. Are there, maybe we can take one, two, three questions then, because people are really getting at it right now, but we shouldn't take it into close to midnight today. So are there any possible negative physical long-term effects that are associated with the mentioned breathing techniques? Not only the last one. So do you know of any?
So in general, not really. What can happen is, so with breathwork, so I think meditative breathing, I don't see any negative effects anyways. Wim Hof breathing and breathwork obviously have the same breathing cycle initially, right? So in a way we can look at it together. So what does happen with breath work is that some people really tense up. A lot of the time that also mirrors something in your emotional life. But so it does mean that, you're breathing and your muscles really start tightening. And that's just, first of all, very uncomfortable while you're doing it. And then you might have sour muscles for a day or two. So that can happen sort of more regularly. I think the main thing I can think of is if you have something like asthma, you want to take it really slow, because otherwise you might go from this like deep hyperventilation into like a shallow hyperventilation, and that can definitely be bad. So if you have any types of conditions like that, you want to take it slow. But again, that doesn't mean you can't do it at all, but you should definitely have a bit of a look at it. Pregnancy, I've done breathwork during my pregnancy, and I've seen other people do it. So again, you can do it if you're very gentle with it.
Yeah. So Zhao is asking maybe an experimental question, because the idea that he has seems strange to some and obvious to others, like always, yeah. So is there a specific brain area that might get more activated when someone has supposed perinatal experiential memories during
yeah.
work? So
I think there's nothing super specific for these types of memories resurfacing versus any others. I would suppose there's definitely hippocampal involvement. If you assume that these are real memories, which at least for some, I'm pretty certain, right? I'm not sure about the birthing memories, and that doesn't mean I'm skeptical. I just really don't know. But some of the early childhood memories, I've at least, again, this is subjective, I've at least seen some people who have later verified what they remembered. So in that case, if we assume these are real memories, I would say hippocampus, and then actually some of the sort of visual-ish areas that help you to kind of reimagine and re-experience that. And probably a lot of the emotional areas, so basal ganglia, possibly amygdala, depending on what the memory is.
Wonderful. So let me finish with a more dry question that is more technical. So you talked about possible fMRI studies in breathwork. Do you think that that can really be done with people who move a lot? Can we control that? Would you feel
super hard?
confident?
Yeah, that's really hard. I think obviously you would definitely want experienced breathwork practitioners who might also be able to kind of guide their, let's say, journey or their process a bit more towards calmer things. But then also I think what would also just be as interesting is to just look at this in a long-term way. So not while people are breathing, but let's say give people 10 different breathwork sessions and then look at the changes from before and after in a long-term kind of way. And that's obviously much easier to do technically.
Yeah. So a lot of questions are popping up. I'm just taking one last one because it's the third time that people are asking into that direction. Is there some benefit to be expected from all three breathing techniques for the elderly, for old people? Is there something to say about old age that is specific in breathing?
That's an interesting one. I think so. Well, I mean, the Wim Hof method, for example, if we assume that someone is fit enough to do this kind of breathing, then that will actually really help your physical health, right? Meditation, I think, has been shown also to just, help with emotional regulation no matter what your age is, right? With breathwork, it's really interesting because I think there've definitely been studies on psychedelics, but I think maybe also one or two on breathwork where you also see that sort of making peace with your life and making peace with the concept of your death can actually be helped by these kinds of sessions. So yes, definitely. If you have someone who's fit enough to do the breath, then I can definitely see good things.
So Martha, I think at some time we have to stop. And so thank you for the breadth of your answers. So reaching from psychological insights, from therapeutic thoughts to neuroscience. So hope to see you back sometime in the future. And some people were asking, can they get the presentation? But everybody who was on the webinar will have access to the record of the webinar. So you will have in some way the presentation of Martha by looking at it. And let's also mention at the end that with our own, the Mind Foundation and Ovid's clinic being open today, I think the first psychedelic clinic in Germany has opened, and we are definitely going for integrating breathwork into the psychotherapies that we develop and evaluate in the future. So thank you again, Martha. Is there something that you would like to say?
Well, thank you also. This was so much fun. And also if someone still has questions or comments, always feel free to contact me after this. And yeah, I'm very much looking forward to what the Ovid Clinic is going to be doing also.
Yeah,
thank you so much for the wonderful talk. And yeah, I guess we can kind of finish here with what is up next with Mind Academy. So I just posted in the chat over here for all of you. We have the next webinar we have is Psychedelic Entrepreneurship, Creating New Paradigms in the Healthcare Economy or Pharma Business as Usual. And then the event after that would be zooming in on psychological mechanisms of psychedelic therapies. So if you enjoyed this talk, then definitely check those out. And yeah, just want to say thank you again, Martha. It was really fascinating, and I'm really excited to share everything I learned. And I'm sure everyone else is as well.
Thanks.
So
Okay.
bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Bye.